On the morning of June 28th, 1914, a 19-year-old named Gavrilo Princip stood on a street corner in Sarajevo, having just watched his assassination attempt fail spectacularly. His group's bomb had missed the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's car by a matter of feet, bounced off the folded roof, and detonated behind them, wounding bystanders instead. The plan was over. Princip went and got a sandwich. Then, through a sequence of events so unlikely that no screenwriter would attempt it, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn, stopped the car to reverse, and stalled it directly in front of the very cafe where Princip happened to be standing. Princip stepped forward and fired twice. Within the hour, both Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were dead. Within 5 weeks, so was the idea that Europe could still avoid a general war. This is the story of how a continent that genuinely did not want a war got itself an enormous one anyway, essentially by everyone agreeing to be reasonable in a way that turned out to be catastrophic. How a single murder in the Balkans ended, with French, Belgian, Russian, German, and British soldiers dying by the millions. It helps to rewind about 40 years to a Europe that had spent a generation building the most elaborate system of mutual protection the world had ever seen, on the theory that if everyone was tied to everyone else, nobody would dare start a fight. It did not work out that way. By 1914, the great powers of Europe had sorted themselves into 2 armed camps. On one side sat the Triple Alliance, Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm II, a monarch with a genuine gift for saying the wrong thing to the wrong newspaper at the wrong time. Austria-Hungary, a sprawling multi-ethnic empire held together mostly out of habit and ruled by the 83-year-old Emperor Franz Joseph, who had already buried a wife, a son, and now a nephew and heir. And Italy, whose commitment to the alliance was generously theoretical. On the other side sat the Triple Entente. France, still smarting from a humiliating defeat to Germany in 1871 and eager for a rematch it would never admit to wanting. Russia, an enormous, underdeveloped empire ruled by Tsar Nicholas II, a man widely agreed to be a devoted father and a genuinely poor decision-maker. And Britain, which preferred not to commit to anything on paper but had quietly arranged its navy and its sympathies in a way that left little doubt. Each alliance was designed as a deterrent. Each government had, at some point, told itself the same reassuring story. Our friends will only have to show up if we're attacked, and nobody is foolish enough to attack first. This was the kind of logic that works perfectly, right up until it doesn't. Austria-Hungary's leadership decided almost immediately that Serbia was behind the assassination, which was not entirely wrong. The plot had been organized with help from a secret Serbian nationalist network with ties inside Serbia's own military. What Austria-Hungary wanted was a short, decisive war that would crush Serbian nationalism once and for all and remind everyone in the Balkans who was in charge. What Austria-Hungary needed first was a guarantee that Russia, Serbia's self-appointed protector, would not intervene. So Vienna asked Berlin for backing, and on July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm gave it, promising German support no matter what Austria-Hungary decided to do. Historians would later call this the blank check. At the time, it was just one monarch doing a favor for another, the way you might agree to co-sign a loan for a friend without reading the terms. Germany's backing secured, Austria-Hungary spent the next 3 weeks drafting an ultimatum to Serbia so aggressive that its own foreign minister reportedly hoped it would be rejected, since rejection was the whole point. It included 10 demands, most of which Serbia could plausibly accept, and at least one, allowing Austro-Hungarian officials to participate directly in the Serbian judicial investigation, that no sovereign state could accept without giving up a piece of its sovereignty. Serbia's government, aware it was badly outmatched militarily, agreed to nearly everything anyway. It hedged on the one clause about foreign officials investigating on Serbian soil and offered to send the rest to international arbitration. Kaiser Wilhelm himself, reading Serbia's reply, remarked that it removed any reason for war. He was, for once, entirely correct and entirely ignored by his own government, which by then had already set the next steps in motion. Austria-Hungary declared the response unsatisfactory and declared war on Serbia on July 28th, almost exactly 1 month after the assassination. This was meant to be a local, contained punishment. It did not stay local for even a week. Russia had spent the better part of a decade cultivating an identity as protector of the Slavic peoples of the Balkans, and Tsar Nicholas II was not prepared to watch Serbia get crushed without responding. On July 30th, under pressure from his generals, who warned that Russia's famously slow mobilization process needed a head start if it was going to matter at all, Nicholas ordered full mobilization of the Russian army. This is the point where the alliance system, built to prevent a general war, started actively causing one, because mobilization was not a symbolic gesture. Under the military planning of the era, mobilizing an army was functionally equivalent to declaring intent to fight, since armies of that size could not be assembled halfway and then quietly.
Germany's own war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was built entirely around the assumption that if war came, Germany would have to defeat France quickly before Russia's slower mobilization could finish and then turn east. The plan required striking first and striking through Belgium, a neutral country that had nothing to do with any of this, in order to knock France out fast enough. Once Russia mobilized, German military leadership argued there was no time left for diplomacy. The entire strategy depended on speed. Germany demanded Russia halt its mobilization within 12 hours. Russia did not. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France, largely because the Schlieffen Plan required it regardless of what France had actually done, and German troops crossed into Belgium the next morning to make the plan's timeline work. That last part is what finally pulled in Britain, which had spent the entire crisis trying very hard not to commit to anything specific. Britain had no formal obligation to fight for France. It did, however, have a decades-old treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality, a piece of paper the German Chancellor privately dismissed as not worth the cost of the war it would trigger. Britain disagreed. When Germany refused to withdraw from Belgium, Britain declared war on August 4th. Within roughly a week, the assassination of one archduke had produced a war involving every major power in Europe, each of whom insisted, more or less sincerely, that they had been left with no other choice. What makes the July crisis such a strange piece of history is how little anyone actually wanted the outcome they got. Austria-Hungary wanted a small, punitive war against Serbia and got a continental catastrophe. Germany wanted to support its ally and avoid looking weak, and ended up fighting a two-front war it had always dreaded. Russia wanted to protect a smaller Slavic nation, and mobilized a machine it could not later stop or steer. France, bound by treaty to Russia, went to war mostly because the dominoes had already been arranged that way years earlier. Britain went to war over a treaty most of its own public had forgotten existed. Practically every leader involved would later claim, with apparent sincerity, that events had simply entirely wrong. Once Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, the machinery of alliances and mobilization timetables took over from the diplomats almost completely. Telegrams between the Kaiser and the Tsar, the two monarchs, were cousins and addressed each other affectionately as Nicky and Willie, went back and forth in the war's final days, each begging the other to stop the process each had already set in motion, neither able to actually reverse it. It is one of history's more uncomfortable footnotes that two men who genuinely liked each other and did not want this outcome nonetheless presided over the opening days of a war that would kill roughly 9 million soldiers. The soldiers themselves marched off in August 1914, largely convinced they would be home by Christmas, a belief shared with confidence by generals on every side who had built their entire strategic doctrines around fast, decisive, mobile warfare. The Schlieffen Plan's rapid strike through Belgium stalled at the Marne in September, and within months, the war that was supposed to be over by winter had frozen into hundreds of miles of trenches stretching from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Nobody had planned for that either. It would take 4 more years and the deaths of an entire generation of young men across a dozen countries to end it. What happened to the people who set this in motion was, in most cases exactly what you'd expect from a story about powerful men who badly misjudged the consequences of their own decisions. Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, whose deaths started the entire chain, were largely forgotten as a cause within a year, buried without the full state honours typically given an heir, partly because Sophie was considered by the Habsburg court to be of insufficiently noble birth, even in death. Gavrilo Princip, too young at 19 to face execution under Austro-Hungarian law, was sentenced to 20 years in prison instead, where he contracted tuberculosis and died in 1918, just months before the war. His single act of violence had helped ignite finally ended. Emperor Franz Joseph, who had signed the declaration of war against Serbia, died in 1916 without seeing how it ended, having outlived nearly his entire family and, functionally, his own empire, which would be dissolved entirely within 2 years of his death. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had offered the blank check and then spent the war's final days frantically trying to unsend it, abdicated in November 1918 and fled to the Netherlands, where he lived out the next 22 years in a kind of bitter, well-funded retirement, still insisting the war had been forced upon him. Tsar Nicholas II fared considerably worse, forced to abdicate in 1917 amid a revolution his own war effort had helped provoke. He was executed along with his entire family by Bolshevik forces in July 1918. Of the men who spent July 1914 trading, ultimatums and blank checks, almost none of them got the war or the peace they had actually been aiming for. Nobody in that room in July 1914 wanted the war that followed. They simply built, piece by piece, treaty by treaty, telegram by telegram, a set of obligations so tightly interlocked that once the first domino tipped, refusing to follow through looked to every government involved like the one option nobody was willing to take.